Shalom and good day to all our many participants in Canada and in Israel. I am Dina Waktel with the Canadian Friends of Hebrew University, and I'm coming to you from rainy and beautiful Vancouver, British Columbia. Before we begin, just a quick reminder that this is a live call, so you may hear a dog barking or a noisy car driving by, but that's the beauty of being live and with you. We are dedicating today's webinar to the memory of our friend, Professor Alan Zisplatt, who passed away this year. I am also very pleased to acknowledge his wife, Linda, who is present on this call today. Alan Zisplatt began his career at the Faculty of Law at the University of British Columbia and was a member of the British Columbia Law Reform Commission. In 1976, Alan and Linda moved to Israel, where he joined a long-standing career with the Ministry of Justice and was also an adjunct professor of law at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and a member of the executive committee of the Israel Association of Canadian Studies. Alan played a leading role in the establishment of the professorship exchange between the law faculties at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem and the University of British Columbia. His legacy inspired friends and family to pay it forward in Alan's memory with the most generous and meaningful new annual scholarship fund for Canadian students who desire to study at Hebrew U. Alan and Linda's home in French Hill, Jerusalem, which is located next to Hebrew U's Mount Scopus campus, was often a welcoming venue for Canadian students studying at the Hebrew University. Alan's love for his profession and mentorship served as a role model to many who then came back to Canada and embarked on successful careers. One such individual is our facilitator today, whom I will introduce now. Adam Dodek is a professor at the University of Ottawa's Faculty of Law and the former dean of the law school. Professor Dodek has written more than 50 articles and written or edited 8 books. His book, The Canadian Constitution, was named one of the top 100 books on Canadian public policy by the Hill Times. Professor Dodek has received a number of honors, including the Canadian Association of Law Teachers Prize for Academic Excellence, the Mandel Medal for Excellence in Legal Writing, and the Law Society Medal by the Law Society of Upper Canada. In 2014, Canadian Lawyer Magazine named Dodek as one of Canada's most influential lawyers. Professor Dodek has a long affiliation with the Hebrew University. He is an alumnus of the one-year program, and he received a Fulbright scholarship after graduating from Harvard Law School to spend a year working at the Supreme Court of Israel while he was researching Israeli constitutional law at the Hebrew University. In 2015, he was a visiting professor at the Halpert Center for Canadian Studies, and this current year, he's also visiting the Halpert Center and is a visiting researcher at the Hebrew University's Faculty of Law. He joins us from Jerusalem. Adam, please take it away.
Thank you so much, Dina. It's an incredible honor and privilege to be moderating today's discussion. I just wanted to say a couple of words about Alan Zisplatt, for whom today's lecture is named and in whose honor Professor Cotler is speaking today. We talk a lot about mentorship and really the lack of mentorship for young people, young lawyers, young people in university. Alan was an incredible mentor to so many young people who came through Jerusalem like myself. There's a Talmudic saying that says, Kol Yisrael arevim ze bazeh. All of Israel are responsible for one another. That is a big task, but how do you actualize that? Well, I think you actualize it person by person, relationship by relationship. And Alan and his wife, Linda, who's with us today, took it upon themselves to be responsible for all Canadians that were living in Jerusalem or coming through Jerusalem. whether those were young lawyers at Israel's Ministry of Justice, visiting ministers from Canada, or 20 or even 17-year-olds spending the year at Hebrew University. Because of their location in French Hill and because of their affiliation with the Hebrew University, they had a special connection to Canadian students who were studying at Hebrew University. And the establishment of the Alan Zisplatt Memorial Scholarship to support Canadians to study at Hebrew U is particularly fitting and a great tribute to a great man and a great friend. I'm proud to support it, and I hope you will too. One of the many Canadians who the Zisplatts hosted at their home was our speaker today, the Honorable Irwin Cotler, who is the International Chair of the Wallenberg Center for Human Rights. Professor Cotler is one of Canada's most distinguished jurists. He is one of Canada's most distinguished jurists. And I use the title professor purposely out of respect and recognition for him because of this. For the past 6 decades, Professor Cotler has been our teacher. He has not only educated Canadians, but he has illuminated and opened the eyes of people around the world to injustice and oppression. He has been a tireless advocate on behalf of individuals and communities who have been oppressed all around the world. His most recent appointment may be his greatest challenge as Canada's first special envoy on preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. Earlier this month, Prime Minister Trudeau announced that this position would become a permanent one. We're looking forward to his remarks here today, and time permitting, within the hour of today's program, Professor Cotler has agreed to entertain questions. So feel free to pose your questions in the Q&A box on your screen. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you Professor Irwin Cotler.
Thank you, Adam, for those very kind words of introduction and your own engagement over the years as a teacher, as a mentor, as a leader, both in Canada and internationally. And we both have been the beneficiaries of Alan Zisplatt, Zichrono Livracha. And I'm delighted that the Hebrew University has established this scholarship in his memory. And it reads that Alan will be remembered as a person who cherished being in Israel, his family, his friends, and his profession. As one of his friends, I have been the beneficiaries of that friendship. Alan and I first met in the summer of 1962 when we were both on a summer fellowship. As it happened, it was that summer in Poland. And Alan enthralled us all during that period in Poland with his brilliance, with his sense of humor, but mostly, and what you mentioned, Adam, he was already mentoring us then, students who we were in Poland. And that began a bond between us that became an enduring friendship, not only between Alan and myself, but I'm delighted to say between also our children, Midor Lador. And this is really part of the way, as you mentioned, Adam, how Alan and Linda would be really the home for all Canadians. And we were, for a period, even neighbors of them in French Hill. And that, for me, always is a landmark with respect to the best of memories and remembrances of a person who I could sum up in one word. Alan was a tzaddik par excellence, the most righteous of people, and all those who ever encountered him and those who even did not know of him perhaps were also the beneficiaries of his great works of tzedakah in the best sense of the word. We meet today at an important historical inflection moment where we are witnessing and experiencing at the same time 4 pandemics. The first is the COVID-19 pandemic, a pandemic that has brought untold suffering, death, and devastation globally, as well as in Canada, and which has disproportionately impacted on the most vulnerable amongst us. And Adam, when you mentioned my appointment as special envoy, I've been struck by how the COVID-19 pandemic has itself been weaponized to resurrect ancient anti-Semitic tropes of the Jews as the poisoners of the wells, where Jews, the Jewish people, and Israel are blamed for having manufactured the COVID-19 virus, for having caused its spread, and indeed for having profited from it, let alone some of the anti-vaxxers invoking a yellow star in a kind of Holocaust trivialization and minimization. And the second pandemic, and not unrelated, has been the pandemic of systemic racism, which has also intensified during the pandemic. I'm speaking here of systemic racism against Indigenous peoples in Canada, where more recently the discovery of unmarked children's graves in Kamloops, British Columbia, is just but one reminder of this historic racism against Indigenous peoples, of systemic racism against Black people and people of color, against Muslims, against Asian Canadians, and where we are witnessing, as we meet, a global, escalating, virulent, and even lethal old new anti-Semitism, which received its first tipping point and manifested itself in the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, 20 years ago, which turned into a conference of racism against Israel and the Jews. As someone who participated in that conference as a member of the Canadian delegation and also in the NGO forums, I can still hear the chanting. I can still see the posters and the leaflets saying, "Too bad Hitler didn't finish the job," comparing Israel and Jews to the Nazis and the like, and thousands of demonstrators in the streets saying that the struggle against apartheid in the 20th century required the dismantling of South Africa as an apartheid state, and the struggle against Israel in the 21st and against apartheid in the 21st century requires the dismantling of Israel as an apartheid state. That Durban conference became the tipping point for this old new anti-Semitism we are witnessing today. And a second tipping point occurred with the Hamas war against Israel last May, where Jews were targeted and threatened in their neighborhoods and in the streets, on the campuses and in their communities, where Holocaust memorials were defaced, where synagogues were torched, where cemeteries were desecrated, and institutions vandalized. The whole finding expressions in two startling empirical data. The first, that we witnessed in 2020, the largest rise in anti-Semitic hate crimes targeting Jews ever. But by May 2021, we had reached the level of all of 2020. And incendiary hate speech on the social media, which, for example, had in 1 week in May, 17,000 tweets that Hitler was right, and I can go on. Therefore, I'm pleased that in the recent Malmo conference that you mentioned, Adam, when the Prime Minister spoke and shared country pledges of Canada, those pledges included combating hate crimes, combating the incendiary hate speech, and expanding the teaching and education about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism across generations. Which leads me to the third and fourth pandemics, which are the main subject matter of my remarks today. Against the backdrop of the first two that I have briefly summarized. And that is a global political pandemic, a global political pandemic characterized by a resurgent global authoritarianism, the backsliding of democracies, assaults on human rights, and political prisoners as a looking glass into this pandemic, the whole underpinned by a fourth pandemic, the culture of impunity, which in fact incentivizes further crimes and further imprisonment. Let me share with you 4 case studies of this resurgent global authoritarianism and political prisoners, respectively, as a looking glass. The first is Xi Jinping's China, and I use that term to distinguish this from the people and publics of China who are otherwise the targets also of this oppression, where China has emerged as the greatest threat to what we call the rules-based international order, in a frontal assault on that order, targeting what Xi Jinping and others have called the 5 poisons, and finding expression in mass atrocities against the Uyghurs, which our Canadian Parliament and others, and on this, both the Trump and Biden administration shared, said constituted acts of genocide under the Genocide Convention. The assaults not only on the democracy movement, but on democracy itself in Hong Kong, and the imprisonment of its media and the like as we speak. The third is the persecution and prosecution of the Falun Gong, which, as the Chinese leadership has said, must be, quote unquote, eradicated. The fourth, the repression of Tibet, and finally, the menacing of Taiwan. But it doesn't end there. It's not all that well known that it is China which imprisons more journalists than any other country in the world today, and the lawyers who would represent them. And it is this suppression of information, this imprisoning of doctors and dissidents that led to the suppression of information respecting the COVID-19 virus, which China then sought to instrumentalize by blaming others for that virus, and which our National Committee of Parliamentarians, Intelligence Committee in Canada, spoke of China's disinformation and penetration in a larger sense, not only on this issue, as representing a threat not only to Canada's national security, but to Canada's democracy itself, and which Freedom House, in a recent report on transnational repression, identified China as one of the major exponents of this transnational repression, threatening their own nationals in other countries. And let me just give you 2 case studies of political prisoners as a looking glass into this Xi Jinping's frontal assault on the international legal order. The first is Dr. Wang Bizang, who came to McGill University as a doctor from China, received his PhD in medicine from McGill University in 1982, and said, you know, while I'd like to practice medicine, it's more important to work for democracy in China. And so he established the Overseas China Democracy Movement. Fast forward to 2002, while on a trip to Vietnam with some of his colleagues, he was abducted from Vietnam, brought back to China, and in a sham trial, unrepresented by counsel and the like, he was convicted of both the crimes of terrorism and treason and sentenced to life imprisonment in solitary confinement, where he has suffered a series of debilitating strokes. And when his daughter, Tiana Wang, named after Tiananmen Square, sought to visit him with her newly born infant child for being first visit with her father, and where her infant son could see his grandfather, after they landed at Beijing airport in a cruel and inhumane treatment, they were put on a plane, boarded back to Canada. I won't go into all the details, just one manifestation of that cruelty. And so Dr. Wang Bizang continues to languish in prison as we meet. I'm delighted that a student group at McGill University, the Wallenberg student group that was established there, has taken up his case and cause, have been joined in by former foreign ministers and ministers of justice, and we will continue our advocacy until he is released. The second case is that of a Uyghur, a Canadian Uyghur, Hussein Chalil, who himself was abducted in 2006 while on a family visit to Kazakhstan, was brought back to China, similarly convicted on trumped-up charges, sentenced also to life imprisonment, tortured in detention, deprived of any visits from family, from consular representatives and the like, and has been languishing himself 15 years in a China prison. I mentioned these two as looking glasses into the larger, massive frontal assault on the global legal order by the CCP. It brings me to the second case study, and that is Khamenei's Iran, which has mounted an assault on every civil society group in Iran, a frontal assault on the women's movement, on journalists, on lawyers, on environmentalists, on religious minorities like the Baha'i, on students, on academic, on trade union leaders, on peace protesters, and the like. The whole documented in a report which our Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights released 3 years ago called Realizing Rights Over Repression, where we named the 19 architects of repression in Iran. At that time, one of those named was the Chief Justice in Iran, Ibrahim Raisi, the person responsible and one of the executioners in the mass executions of dissidents in Iran in 1988, who went on to become Attorney General responsible for more executions, became Chief Justice, and now, as we meet, is the president of Iran, engaged in the Iranian fourfold threat: nuclear, terrorist, hegemonic incitement, along with this massive domestic repression. And let me just identify two political prisoners in Iran that have a Canadian connection here too as a looking glass. The first is Reza Aslami, who is a dual Iranian-Canadian national. He actually has a PhD in law from McGill University, who went back to Iran and became a professor of environmental law in Iran, but who recently was convicted and sentenced to 7 years in prison, here too on trumped up charges. One of those that he was involved in representing happens to have been, an environmentalist. And so we see the kinds of situations of the targeting of human rights lawyers, the targeting of environmentalists. In fact, all the leading environmentalists in Iran are now imprisoned as I speak with you. And so his is a case of and cause which has a particular Canadian connection, not only because of the duality of his citizenship, but because Canada, to its credit, led a recent international declaration on arbitrary detention, now signed by 65 states, to target this form of hostage diplomacy, this imprisonment of dual nationals. And we trust that these 65 states and others now engaged in implementing this declaration on arbitrary detention will take up the case of Reza Aslami. And then there is Nasreen Sotoudeh, the iconic Iranian woman human rights lawyer that I've been representing since her first imprisonment in 2011, when I was then a parliamentarian, in successive arrests over the years. And where 3 years ago, this iconic woman human rights lawyer, who's gone down the line for the women's movement, for journalists who've been silenced, for environmentalists who've been imprisoned, for religious minorities like the Baha'i, for other lawyers who've been imprisoned, for other political prisoners, until she too became a political prisoner 3 years ago, a woman in her late 50s sentenced to 38 years in prison and 148 lashes, a virtual death sentence. And why I spoke about the culture of impunity is because 2 days after her conviction and sentence, Iran was elected to the UN Commission on Women's Rights. So you see how the culture of impunity incentivizes this type of criminalization of innocence that is engaged in by China and Iran. And now I'll turn to the third case study, and that is Maduro's Venezuela. 3 years ago, as a member of the Organization of American States panel of what was called independent legal experts to look into whether there are reasonable grounds to believe that crimes against humanity are being committed in Venezuela, we determined in our report at the end of May 2018, after holding hearings in Washington, hearing witness testimony, examining all the documentary evidence, we concluded that 7 major crimes against humanity were being committed in Venezuela, including state-orchestrated humanitarian suffering, the weaponization of food and medicine, targeting in particular the political opposition or those believed to be in the political opposition in Venezuela. And so this particular determination of ours was followed by the first ever collective referral by 7 states of a state party to the International Criminal Court, Venezuela, to the ICC for prospective investigation and prosecution. To date, that investigation has yet to be opened, and we have renewed our call. When I say we, Justices Santiago Canton of Argentina and Justice Manuel Robles Ventura of Costa Rica, with whom I joined on this OAS panel, we've renewed again our call on Venezuela to open an investigation. But let me just give you, as a looking glass, the cases of 2 political prisoners, whom I've also been involved in. The Wallenberg Center has been involved in their representation and their case and causes. The first is Leopoldo Lopez, one of the founders of the democracy opposition movement in Venezuela, who was arrested himself on trumped-up charges in 2014 and like. But why I'm sharing this with you is that during our hearings in Washington, the judge who had issued the arrest warrant, Renata Tovar, Venezuelan judge who escaped, came before our hearings and said that she was ordered to issue false arrest warrants against Leopoldo Lopez unless she would suffer what has come to be known as the Afuni effect, named after Judge Maria Lourdes Afuni in Venezuela, who, after acquitting a prisoner in Venezuela, as duty bound to do in terms of having heard the facts and the law determined that that person was innocent, was then herself imprisoned, tortured in detention. She is languishing in prison as we speak. Her detention after 10 years continued with a new invented charge of spiritual corruption. And the Afuni effect has been held out by the Maduro regime to warn all would-be judges and lawyers that you will suffer the Afuni effect if you engage in any kind of human rights work whatsoever. And so Renata Tovar was a case study, but so was Franklin Neves, the prosecutor in the Leopoldo Lopez case, who also appeared before our hearing, who also had escaped from Venezuela and told us that he was forced to issue false and trumped up charges against Leopoldo Lopez, lest he too fall victim to the Afuni effect. And we heard from witnesses who were told that they were coerced and indeed tortured into false confessions against Leopoldo Lopez. So I share with you these 2 political prisoners, Leopoldo Lopez and Judge Maria Lourdes Afuni, as 2 looking glasses into the massive domestic repression in Venezuela. Happily, Leopoldo Lopez escaped from Venezuela and is now living with his family in Spain. But Judge Maria Lourdes Afuni is still, as I mentioned, detained and has been tortured in detention in Venezuela. A 4th case is, and the final one, is that of MBS Mohammed bin Salman's Saudi Arabia. And here too, I've been involved in representing a blogger, Raif Badawi, a Saudi blogger, now entering his 10th year of imprisonment in Saudi Arabia for saying 10 years ago what Mohammed bin Salman has himself been saying for the last 4 years, namely calling for a more open Saudi Arabia, for a more moderate Islam. His sister, Samar Badawi, was imprisoned for calling for the right to drive. Now, Mohammed bin Salman instituted the reform of women having the right to drive, but then imprisoned all the women who had called for the reform, one of them being Samar Badawi, Raif Badawi's sister. And his lawyer, Abu Wakir, has been also imprisoned and sentenced to 15 years in prison for nothing other than taking up the case of Raif Badawi. But why I'm telling you all this is not only these political prisoners as a looking glass into the authoritarianism in Saudi Arabia, but also the backsliding of democracies. And I'll give you one illustration. A little over 3 years ago, the then Foreign Minister of Canada, Chrystia Freeland, called for the release of the Badawis. Saudi Arabian authorities erupted in furor. They ejected the Canadian ambassador to Saudi Arabia. They recalled the Saudi ambassador to Canada. They suspended all trade and investment with Canada. They recalled 15,000 Saudi students studying in Canada, returning them to Saudi Arabia. In a word, a self-inflicted wound. And I'm sharing this with you because after that, not one democracy came to Canada's defense. And 2 months later, we witnessed the brutal assassination of Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. And as I wrote then and share with you today, that it was the enabling and silence of the democracies which enabled Mohammed bin Salman and Saudi authorities to feel that they could conduct these assassinations with impunity. And while there was the beginnings of protest and outrage in the immediate aftermath of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, as we recently commemorated the 3rd anniversary of Khashoggi's murder, I regret to say that Saudi Arabia had been elected last year as the chair of the G20. And at the meeting of the G20, not one country brought up the case and cause of the Badawis. And so this culture of impunity incentivizes further crimes. Let me close by saying that sharing with you these four pandemics, and in particular, the global political pandemics and political prisoners as a looking glass, I'll just close and say that the world needs more Alan Zisblat's blessed memory. We need people, Sadiqim, righteous people who will take up the cause of those in prison. And I'm hopeful also that the Hebrew University Faculty of Law will adopt one of these political prisoners and engage their students, amongst whom will be the Canadian students, beneficiaries of this memorial scholarship, in taking up the case and cause of one of these political prisoners who are a looking glass into this global political pandemic. And with the continuation of that advocacy, we can yet see these political prisoners released, these authoritarians held accountable, and secure justice for the victims and accountability for the human rights violators. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Cotler. We have time for a number of questions, and the Q&A function's open. We already have a number of questions. I'll start off with a question from Morris Pripstein. What collective actions, if any, from foreign governments can realistically influence human rights violations in China and Iran?
Let me begin with the actions that can be taken. And the worst thing, of course, is inaction. What we've learned on Elie Wiesel of blessed memory, we just recently celebrated, his birthday and the 5th anniversary of his passing. He always would say and speak of the danger of silence in the face of evil, of the danger of indifference and inaction in the face of mass atrocity and genocide. Indeed, what makes the Holocaust and the genocides that follows, I make no analogies to the Holocaust, but what makes the Holocaust and the genocides that followed so unspeakable are not only the horrors of the Holocaust and these genocides, like what is now happening with the Uyghurs. What makes them so unspeakable are not only the horrors themselves, but that these horrors were preventable. Nobody can say we did not know. We knew, but we did not act. And so, for example, now with regard to China, number one, we've been seeking the establishment of an independent, impartial, international investigation of what has been happening in Xinjiang province in China, which of course China has refused itself a self-incriminating act. We have sought for the use of Magnitsky sanctions to target the major human rights violators. And finally, there's been a modest imposition of a few Magnitsky sanctions on some senior China officials, but nowhere enough. Number three, we have to, at this point, come together in terms of establishing a common front of the community of democracies against China, because China has succeeded in using its asymmetrical economic leverage, among others, in targeting and bullying the democracies one by one, Japan, Australia, Canada, and the like. That is why a little over a year ago, we formed the Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China, of which I'm co-chair from Canada. It is this Inter-Parliamentary Alliance on China which first unmasked, unexposed these mass atrocities which constitute genocide. We have since been making representations to various parliaments, and I'm delighted Canada became the first parliament in the world to determine that the acts targeting the Uyghurs are acts constitutive of genocide under the Genocide Convention. That has been followed by Lithuania and other parliaments, and we are engaged now in a multilateral effort to get a whole number of countries to impose targeted Magnitsky sanctions and help bring justice for the victims and accountability for the violators, as well as protection with respect to the non-importation of the produce of slave labor that has been taking place, the enactment of legislation for that purpose and the like, and taking up, as I mentioned, the particular cases and causes of these political prisoners. That's with respect to China. I've otherwise shared a 10-point action plan, which was just published yet again in an article last week in the Epoch Times, and before that in a CBC interview. But with regard to Iran, I regret to say that while we identified in our report 3 years ago, the report that I mentioned, the 19 major architects of repression in Iran, and called for the imposition of Magnitsky sanctions against them, among other things, not one of these 19 has yet been targeted for Magnitsky sanctions. And so we need to get our Canadian government, our Canadian Parliament engaged with respect to the imposition of targeted Magnitsky sanctions. Next month, we will be releasing yet another report, when I say we, the Raoul Wallenberg Center for Human Rights, documenting the massive repression in Iran. And we can begin with taking up the cases and causes, as I mentioned, of a Canadian Iranian national, professor of law, PhD from McGill University, Reza Aslami. I wrote to our then Foreign Minister, Marc Garneau, on the occasion of his imprisonment for Canada to take up his case. Similarly with Nasrin Sotoudeh, I'm pleased to say that in that case, there has been movement in that Prime Minister Trudeau, President Biden, President Macron have taken up her case and cause. A film documentary has been produced. That at least has resulted in her now, as we meet, being out on a medical furlough, which we hope will mean that she will not be soon returned to prison. But this has happened before, and she was returned to prison and is, in fact, languishing in one of the worst prisons in Iran. So we have to, in fact, take up the case and causes of these political prisoners as looking glasses into the larger repression.
Thank you. We have a question about the third of your 4 pandemics, the political pandemic. And Mark Welch asks, could you comment on the growth of illiberal democracies, for example, in Hungary, where there may not be a one-party state or a dictatorship?
Yes, that's one of the phenomenon that we're witnessing is, of course, the phenomenon of illiberal democracies. We're seeing that not only in Hungary, but we're seeing it also in Poland. We've seen in Poland the manner in which they've instituted chilling actions against Holocaust researchers like Dr. Jan Grabowski at the University of Ottawa. And so these illiberal democracies also have to be held to account, because they are undermining as well action by the European Union, which often requires the kind of consensus that cannot be secured when Poland and Hungary do not partake of that necessary consensus. And we're witnessing, such phenomenon of a liberal populism or a polarizing populism in our own democracies, more so in the United States, but we're not without that presence here in Canada. So as part of the movement for democratic resilience and renewal, we met recently in Prague. When I say we, the International Coalition for Democratic Renewal, of which our Raoul Wallenberg Center is a part of, in order to see here too how we can hold these illiberal democracies and their leadership accountable.
I wanted to ask you a question that connects your 4 pandemics that you had raised and that you have identified. And my question was, how do you advocate for political prisoners in an age of COVID? And what you think the impact, maybe going beyond that, as we move, hopefully, out of a COVID world back into more quote unquote normal life. What do you think the impact of COVID is going to be on the 3 other pandemics that you identified?
Well, I think that the advent of COVID resulted in more repression taking place and less reporting of that repression taking place. But we have sought, even with COVID, to engage in the same advocacy model that we have been using before. That is a kind of a 10-point advocacy model. I will not, burden you with it, but just to mention some of them, because whether or not it's COVID, these same initiatives can and must be taken. The first is what is called the mobilization of shame against the human rights violator, a lesson taught to me some 50 years ago by Andrei Sakharov, and it is something that we sought to internalize then and act upon it since. The second, which follows from the first, is to make representations to the human rights violator government based on the violation of their own laws, not violation of Canadian or American law and the like. And so we made representations to the Iranian government documenting their violations of the Iranian constitution, their violations of international treaty obligations of which they are a state party. And we've done this with the other human rights violators of the resurgent global authoritarianism that I mentioned. In other words, making the case, unmasking and exposing their violations of their own laws. The third is invoking the support of our host country, namely Canada, Canadian government, Canadian parliamentarians, and therefore we have set up a Raoul Wallenberg all-party parliamentary caucus on human rights to take up these cases and causes. And we've invited parliamentarians from all causes, from all parties, to adopt a political prisoner and advance that case and cause. The fourth is the internationalization of the advocacy. So, for example, with regard to the case of Raif Badawi, and here's an example, Adam, directly on point. We used to visit the American House of Representatives and Senate, Congress and Senate. We were not able to do this during the COVID-19. There's no substitute for that kind of human encounter where we met with the chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee in the House and the Senate, where resolutions were then unanimously adopted. But we maintain the same relationships and seek to continue the internationalization of advocacy with the American Congress, with the European Parliament and the like. And just last week, a statement was issued by Liberal International. I happen to sit on their Human Rights Committee, calling for the release of Raif Badawi. And so we've used that consortium of Liberal International, which has small L liberal parties from across the world, to also take up the cases of political prisoners. And there are other parts of that model. We seek to involve students to be at the forefront of that movement, because students come with a certain moral credibility to engage the media, because unless we can get this reported, the mobilization of shame cannot be effective. And in particular, we use all the international legal procedures available to us. That is, filing petitions with the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, filing petitions with each of the UN Special Rapporteurs, whether it be UN Special Rapporteur on torture or the UN Special Rapporteur on women's rights and the like, and engage them in making individual and collective statements on behalf of individual political prisoners or on behalf of the larger case and cause. And I'm pleased to be able to say that those UN Special Rapporteurs have issued statements calling upon the respective authoritarian governments to release these political prisoners. And sometimes it has brought about, as I say, if not a release, at least an alteration in the prison conditions, or have them released on furlough and being able to be with their families, and in some instances actually help to bring about their release. So we have, as I say, this 10-point advocacy model, and we seek to engage it with respect to each of the political prisoners with which we are involved.
Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. The next question is from Stephen Lipper, who starts off by thanking you for taking on a new position as Canada's first special envoy on preserving Holocaust remembrance and combating anti-Semitism. And Mr. Lipper asks, why do campuses apply BDS to Israel and not to China? Why do Arab countries stay silent about the Uyghur genocide while attacking Israel?
Well, that's a case study of the hypocrisy of the BDS movement, which purports to hold itself out as a human rights movement, but which singles out only one state, Israel, and one people, the Jewish people, for selective opprobrium and indictment, and which is, in that sense, a standing violation of the IRA working definition on anti-Semitism. I might add, with regard to that the BDS movement was itself launched at Durban in 2001. And there's a little known but very important resolution passed by the Canadian Parliament, unanimously adopted by the Canadian Parliament in February 2015, which had three parts to it, and I'll summarize it briefly, and I trust it also relates to Steve's question. The first part was, alarmed at the growing global escalation in anti-Semitism. That was February 2015. There's been an exponential rise since then. Second, calls upon the Canadian government to make the combating of anti-Semitism a priority in both our domestic and foreign policy. That was a unanimous resolution of Parliament. One might not be able to secure that today, but that is there as a matter of principle and precedent. And the third part, which deals also directly with Steve's question, said that criticizing Israel is not anti-Semitic and saying so is wrong, but singling Israel out for selective opprobrium and indictment, denying Israel's right to exist, let alone calling for its destruction, is hateful and discriminatory and dishonest, and not saying so is hypocritical, is dishonest. And so that is something we need to recall when we address these issues. I'm delighted also that the Prime Minister, in his talk at Malmo on behalf of the Canadian people, shared a number of country pledges. And amongst those country pledges, some of which I referenced earlier, was indeed to make the combating of anti-Semitism part of the larger Canadian agenda for the promotion and protection of human rights and international justice in our time.
I'm going to combine two questions, one from Peter Villani and the other from Sam Epstein, and they're both about, Peter asks, how does one effectively advocate for human rights when the violating countries themselves are named to UN committees, like the example you gave about Iran, and host the Olympics, like China? Doesn't that hinder your work? And the follow-up from Sam is, shouldn't democratic countries or a country like Canada not boycott the Olympics in China?
Okay, let me just say, one of the things in this, I'm one of those who always harkens back to the saying of Robert Kennedy that he himself would cite from George Bernard Shaw and others, to the fact that some people see things as they are and ask why. I see, or I dream of things as they might be and ask why not. In other words, we have to continue to be engaged in the trenches, on the ground, all the time. It's very easy to become discouraged, let alone also become cynical. Take the case of Iran. When I was a member of parliament, we founded then what was called Iran Accountability Week. And we held hearings for 2 weeks every year in parliament. All parties produced a report, again, to unmask and expose the crimes against humanity being committed in Iran. Did this bring about any difference? All I can tell you is I remember something that Avital Sharansky once said. She was visiting Canada when I was then representing Natan Sharansky. It was 8 years into his imprisonment. We had a press conference and the press said, you know, Mrs. Sharansky, what are all these demonstrations doing? What are all these calls doing? Your husband is still in prison. And she said, yes, he's still in prison, but he is still alive. And if we did not have these demonstrations, I don't know if he would still be alive. And if we don't have these demonstrations, he will not be released. And I hope that if we continue with these demonstrations and advocacy, he will be released. And a year later, Anatoly Sharansky was in fact released. So you never know when the tipping point to bring about that release will come. I always say it's usually not because of the justice of the cause, it's because the leader recognizes their own self-interest in it. Let me just share a quick story on this. Gorbachev was on a panel with regard to Soviet Jewry a year after Sharansky's release. I happened to be on the same panel. I took the occasion to ask him if he had anything to do with Sharansky's release, because Sharansky was released within a year of his becoming the president of the Soviet Union. And he told an interesting story. He said, you know, I was the Secretary of Agriculture in the Soviet Union. He said, I have to tell you, he said, you may be surprised by this, I never heard of Anatoly Sharansky. I know he was a household word. I never heard of him. I came to Canada. It was my first trip outside the Soviet Union as the Secretary of Agriculture in the Soviet Union. I appeared before your parliamentary committee on agriculture. Yes, we discussed agriculture, but then they kept asking me questions about this Sharansky. I left the parliament buildings and there was this big demonstration for this Sharansky. As I said, I didn't know who he was. I then spent the weekend as the guest of your Minister of Agriculture, Eugene Whalen. Yes, we talk about agriculture, but he kept bringing up the case of Sharansky. So I became president of the Soviet Union some months later. I looked up the case of this Anatoly Sharansky. Yet he was a troublemaker. He says, and this is the important but his imprisonment was costing us. It was costing us politically. It was costing us diplomatically. It was costing us economically. And so I ordered his release in our self-interest. And so that's what I learned, the tipping point, the self-interest. We have to make these countries realize when it's in their self-interest to do so. And this brings me to the question of the boycott of the Olympic Games. I've been one of those who've been calling initially for the boycott of the Games when the Games were first held in China in 2008. As a member of parliament in 2002, I called for the Olympics not to be held in China. China then gave undertakings that it would in fact free political prisoners, journalists, and the like. What happened in 2008 is that they arrested more journalists and more political prisoners. similarly have been part of a movement to move the location, because we don't want to punish the athletes. We are seeking to have the Olympic Games moved to another location in Canada, because its Winter Games would be a perfect location for that. And we've used the analogy, 1936, when the games were held in Germany, became known as the Olympic Games of Shame. And we had not yet gone down the road to the Holocaust, although we had the Nuremberg race laws, etc. It was just before Kristallnacht. Right now, we know that there are mass atrocities targeting the Uyghurs that are acts constitutive of genocide. Nobody can say we did not know. Our Wallenberg Center, among others, published a documented report on genocide of the Uyghurs that has been endorsed by 30 international and genocide scholars across the world. So we don't want these games to be known as the games of shame. And so this too has to be a call for the international community to move the Olympic Games. I'm pleased to say that the Canadian Parliament, when it adopted the resolution saying that what was happening with the Uyghurs were acts constitutive of genocide, they also adopted a resolution to move the Olympic Games. And our Interparliamentary Alliance on China is meeting just in a few days with the G20 in Rome, where we are once again going to call for the removal of the games from China.
Thank you, Irwin. We're coming up on 2 minutes before the hour, and I have strict instructions that we're not to go over time. So I'm going to end with one final question on a positive note from Ellen Masters, who thanks you for your continued work on all of these important issues, as we all do. And she asks, how can I help? In her case, she asks, how can she help Nazreen? And so I would just want to expand that. What can the almost 200 people that are listening here, and what can we do to help support political prisoners, or to help support, to combat the 4 pandemics that you've identified today?
Well, I think, a lot of the people on the call are Canadians, and we certainly can call on our parliamentarians, those who have taken up the cases of these political prisoners, to support them in that. We ourselves can take up these cases in the world of social media. We can make these cases known in whatever way we ourselves engage on social media, and whatever blog and whatever support and whatever representations we each make. It's one case at a time. It's one person at a time. It's one day at a time. But all of this together creates a critical mass of advocacy. So we should see each one of us as having the capacity to make a difference. And any act that we make on any particular day can have impact down the line. So let's put it this way, and I'll conclude. Let us say that every day we should take up the case and cause of one particular prisoner and undertake one act on behalf of that particular political prisoner that one day. If we don't do it that day, I don't want you to feel, well, therefore I've lost the obligation. At least once a week, make one act, and one deed at a time will have a difference.
Thank you very much, Professor Cotler, and thank you for your remarks today. Thank you for ending on a positive note and giving us all something concrete that we can do to advance to defend political prisoners around the world, and really to help support the cause of human rights. I want to thank the Canadian Friends of Hebrew University for organizing today's webinar, and I want to thank them for creating the Alan Zisplatt Memorial Scholarship Fund, and you have the link in the chat if you would like to contribute to support that fund. And on behalf of everyone, Professor Cotler, thank you so much for taking time out today to share your thoughts on these incredibly important issues with us. And thank you very much for all of your work. And we look forward to your continuing leadership and teaching for many years to come. Thank you very much. Have a good day, everyone.
Thank you. Good day to everyone.